Okay, y'all. Okay, y'all. I'm back. We're about to do a quick. No, not a quick. We'll see. We'll see. 30 minutes an hour, but rejoining Al Bielek's autobiography. He said what's about to happen. Just to give you, just to clue you in, because I know I was dozing off last time, or towards the end of it, before I cut off. What is going on is he's in the life of they've age regressed him and put him in the body. Um, they've taken him from Ed Cameron, age regressed him, and put him back into the life of Al Bielek. He's grown up with the Al Bielek family now as Al Bielek, and then he's worked for the military, Navy. He a lot of this stuff is in his unconscious mind. He's really acting out who he really is. So he goes to Navy again, and he becomes fascinated after the World War II. He becomes fascinated with the Philadelphia experiment, because in his life as Ed Cameron, he was a part of it, which is crazy because, I mean, these things could have happened simultaneously. Just so you know, between now and now, maybe I was meant to share this by source. I had a dream that, like, I was walking by myself in a past life. So maybe this influenced it, though, so led to that dream. It was weird. I don't even know how to explain it, because and one day I was walking by myself. The dream was many layers, but that's not what this is about. But I was thinking about it, I was like, that had to be wild if he ever walked by himself. That's Al Bielek. Well, he says, speaking of that, he says he's about to become fascinated with the Philadelphia experiment. He's about to meet his brother, I think James Cameron or Ed Cameron. I think I'm just making a connection here anyway, and talking to you all, reflecting on it, because he says he's hanging out with somebody, and they go into. He says he's gonna say he meets someone. They have an affinity for one another. Like, man, maybe we knew each other in a past life. And then he says, it's about to be like next 10 minutes. He says, of course, that turned out to be the biggest joke ever. Like, have you guys ever been here? They're gonna go to the Montauk Project. So let's just jump in, and I've talked enough. I've talked too much. Let's just jump in and let's go.
I refused to do it. We were not under compulsion to do it, and we were not under compulsion to join the reserves at that time. Approximately a year and a half later, it was mandatory to become a reservist, which, of course, pulled a few friends of mine back in the time and period of the Korean War.
This is the end of World War II.
I kept growing up. I went through school. I went to try a business of my own for a number of years. Between the period of roughly 1947 and 1951. It didn't go well. This was in New Jersey. I went to college in NCE, Newark College of Engineering, Newark, New Jersey. And in 1953, I got the notion, I'm fed up with this living in New Jersey with my folks. I'm moving to California. I had a job for a year and a half with a rather interesting company on the East Coast. I was a field engineer for an electronics firm that supplied flight simulators for the Air Force and other organizations, both commercial and military. Went to California, continued my schooling. Eventually wound up as a consulting electronic engineer. That started in 1958 and went on for 30 years to 1988, when I retired from the engineering profession. Not absolute and total, but that was the way it worked. It wasn't as I wanted to, but that's the way it happened. In that period of time, of course, I met a number of interesting people like Ivan T. Sanderson, and I had picked up a few magazines dealing with the Philadelphia experiment and Einstein's connection with it. And I had an absolute fascination with the subject during this period. And the fascination had become virtually a compulsion before long to find any information I could whatsoever about the subject. I became acquainted with Ivan T. Sanderson, who was a British naturalist who had moved to New York just prior to the end of World War II. And I met him in 1951. I dropped association in 1953 because of my travels with my company as a flight simulator specialist. And in 1963, I recontacted him while I was in Pennsylvania and became reacquainted, and then I was on his staff. He also had a great interest in the Philadelphia experiment, and since he had been in intelligence, British intelligence, was a sort of a special guest, if you will, in the Pentagon almost any time you wanted to go down there and talk with the intelligence people and other officers in the Navy. And they tossed around a lot of subjects. UFOs was common gossip at that time. well recognized and accepted by the military, but not for the outside public's consumption, totally internal. And he couldn't find anything out about the Philadelphia experiment. He was certain that something had happened. The only thing the Navy would admit to him was a DE-173 and others. They wouldn't say more than that. Of course, it was in the records that there was a DE-173 commissioned on 27 August 1943, served in the war, and everything else which I've said about it since when I went to the Greeks. But, of course, at that point, nothing about it coming back. And he couldn't find out a thing. I couldn't find anything out, but my interest remained. A series of books were written after that, starting in 1978. The first one was entitled Thin Air by two authors whom I do not know who they are. It was a fiction story, basically, but the background information they gave regarding the Philadelphia experiment was quite accurate, speaking in retrospect. They mentioned the man who was a scientist who gave them all the information to write the book, a man they called Dr. Reno, R-E-N-O. No connection with Janet Reno. And described the house and the factory of cats, and the place was a total dismayed wreck, all of which was absolutely correct fact. And then, of course, came the next book, next year, 1979, The Philadelphia Experiment, Project Invisibility by Berlitz and Moore. And Moore never got his facts straight, but there's one or two things in there which did hang together. And again, the mention of Dr. Reno, describing the same location, that this is the source of much of their information. Except obviously they didn't get enough of correct information from Dr. Reno, who turns out to be Dr. John von Neumann. That, of course, took quite a bit of detective work and quite some time to find out. Well, I went on my merry way in I was a member, of course, since this is of importance, of the USPA, United States Psychotronics Association, originally in its founding year in 1975 called the U.S. Radionics Association, but they changed it the next year because of the connotation of radionics and the somewhat bad taste it had in the mouth of scientists and some other people. They renamed it the Psychotronics Association. I was a founding member, and of course the thing is not defunct. It's in limbo today. It's not what it was, but they still have meetings. Through that organization and its annual meetings, I met Preston Nichols. And Preston Nichols at that time, this was 1981, was probably still involved in the Montauk Project, of which I had no recall at the point of time I'm referring to. And sometime later, it was actually 83 I met him, not 81. And in 85, he was at another conference and meeting for the USPA, in which he brought a new assistant called Duncan Cameron. I knew nothing about Duncan at that point because I was still, shall I say, heavily under the weather of a very heavy brainwashing, both for the Philadelphia experiment and my involvement in the Montauk Project. And I might add for many other projects.
So he said Duncan Cameron, but Al Bielek was Ed Cameron, Duncan Cameron's brother. So here we go. The connection I thought I made wasn't there. He wasn't meeting himself. He was meeting his brother from his past life.
Well, I saw Preston there. He gave a paper in 85, and Duncan was part of that presentation. And I saw a person I considered a psychic sensitive. I had a sort of feeling of kinship to him. I cornered him one day in the cafeteria of this facility where they're holding the meeting, which was in Dayton, Ohio. And we talked for about 2.5 hours. About halfway through this, I got this strange feeling in the pit of my stomach. I knew this guy from someplace. So I finally asked him, I says, Duncan, do you have any feeling, any idea that possibly you know me from somewhere? He said, yes. I says, I do. I says, from where? He says, I have no idea. And I said, I got the same feeling. I also have no idea where it's from. Before the meeting broke up and we left, Preston had invited me to come visit him sometime at his lab facility on Long Island. Now, this meeting was held in July of 1985, and I availed myself of his invite in August of 85, Duncan Cameron saying he would put me up at his house on Long Island, which is fairly close to where Preston lives. I still couldn't figure out where I knew him from, but I had the feeling, well, is it possible it's from a past life? Well, that was part of the answer, but that was not the real answer I was interested in. I won't go into all of the ideas about reincarnation. That's not part of this story, not part of this presentation and the facts which I'm trying to deal with. In August of 85, I went there, stayed at Duncan's place, intending to stay a weekend. I wound up staying 2 weeks. And on one of the visits with Preston, he says, I want to take you two out to a place on the eastern tip of Long Island. I'm not going to tell you what it's all about, but I know you two are sensitive. And I've been out there many times because I'm a surplus electronics dealer, but I know you guys haven't been there before. Well, of course, that turned out to be the biggest joke of the century, but at that point, we didn't know it was any different. And he took us out in his truck, his car at that time. He had a van. Took us to the base, parked to the parking lot outside the base. The fences were down. It was totally deserted, and we wandered all over the place. And I could feel, as Duncan did, some horrendous projects had taken place there in the recent years and was obviously completely shut down, totally abandoned, with wrecked equipment everywhere, unwrecked, completely intact electronic equipment in the buildings. The doors were unlocked. There was nobody to patrol the place, nobody looking after it. It was like somebody packed up and walked out and left this huge base with all this equipment on many, many military buildings behind. A huge power plant, this giant radar tower, and we couldn't figure it out. But we had the feeling that something terrible had happened there, and this was the key to what happened later. Terminated the visit, of course, and I went back to where I was living at that time, which was Phoenix, Arizona. I continued my employment and work, and eventually, in 1986, in a second visit, which was in May of 1986, after having talked with some friends in Phoenix, one of whom was a engineering minor at that point at ASU, but contacted me because of my interest in Tesla and some of Tesla's work. And he had a group of friends, the three of them, together we talked. And I told him about my visit to Montauk Point and this huge installation. I said, it was totally abandoned, but walking around it, says, my guess was that somebody spent an enormous sum of money on this operation. My guess at that time was $50 billion, which wasn't too far off from the mark. Little did I know at that time that this guy, Lenny, full name Lenny Perlstein, was the nephew of Senator Barry Goldwater. Well, the story, of course, went to Goldwater. Goldwater was still a senator at that time. And he was also chairman of the Armed Services Oversight Committee. Well, he started looking through the records of Congress and the Senate to see if any money was spent on a project out there. He couldn't find anything. He got very frustrated. Of course, there was a military base that had been closed. It was closed in 1968 officially, and the state of New York was supposed to take the place over as a park. But little is known about the underground operations, and some of them above ground. But as our research proved later, this was all run on private money, a private group, and this was going back to 1947. This was, of course, in the period, speaking of overlapping my life as Al Bielek and Ed Cameron, when Operation Paperclip had been completed and all of the German scientists came into the U.S., they went to work at Brookhaven National Laboratories to continue projects they had been working on in Germany, namely time travel and also mind control. The mind control becomes a very interesting and very strong issue today, but I will go into it because it wasn't a strong issue at that time, but was one of the research programs. They were kicked out of Brookhaven in 1968 because somebody started reading their monthly reports, which are required of a tax-supported scientific institution. They looked for a new home. They found it at Montauk Point, and the military people. They moved in. The military people, shortly after that, moved out for the most part, and they continued their operations, funded privately, without any government money. Therefore, there was no need for an oversight on the place. But of course, our dear intelligence people, not to berate them, CIA, NSA, ONI, Office of Naval Intelligence, DIA, all of them knew everything that was going on. And of course, they were working with the people who were there because there was another aspect to this, which the public has never learned, except in a few cases and instances. And very few people know about the Montauk research program out there at Montauk Point, unless they were part of it. And there are quite a few people around today who were part of it. That program went into high gear after 1968. It's a very long and drawn-out story. But basically, the continuation of German research took place there because of certain UFO activities. And what happened in 1954, this is part of the public record, which is still concealed, but it is public because I have read not the records, but private letters, a communication from somebody who was witness to this at Edwards Air Force Base. Believe it or not, a UFO landed in the middle of the base. The aliens got out, said to the scientists were there, including the CIA, who has some very good scientists. They do have some excellent technical people. There's no question about it. Said, okay, you guys think you're so smart and know what it's all about. See if you can get into our ships. We'll just stand by and watch you and see what you can do. In 2 weeks' time, they found out they couldn't get into the ships. They didn't know how to enter them. They tried cutting torches, diamond cutters, everything else on the hull. Couldn't cut it, couldn't scratch it, couldn't do anything. Well, this became exceedingly frustrating to the scientists there. And, of course, the word went back through the community of intelligence groups and the military to the President of the United States, Dwight Eisenhower. Get out here and take a look at what's going on. So we took a vacation trip to go to one of the golfing courses, which were nearby. Eisenhower was known as the golfing president. He spent a lot of time on the golf course. So we took a little trip to California, and then they disappeared one night or one weekend to Edwards. And he witnessed the ship, and they wouldn't let him get up right next to it. They wouldn't let him talk to the aliens. But the record is that the military told him, this is technology, we have no idea what it is, and we've got to buy time. Make a treaty. We don't care what kind of a treaty you make one, we've got to buy time. So one was hammered out, which in essence, the name of the treaty, for the record, was the Greada Treaty. I'm not going to say how I found that out. And it said in essence that neither us nor the aliens will interfere with either's civilization. We will sort of keep our hands off of each other. We'll go each our own way, but there will be cooperation. There'll be technical information and expertise given to us that we don't have. They wanted us to provide underground bases and medical expertise to help them with the problem they had, which they said was that we have serious problems. Our race is degenerating. We need to create a new line of bodies. That was the story. Many people have reported this since and have discussed it. And many underground bases were built over a period of time, starting in 1959. Because of this treaty, and this is the aspect that's important, when the Montauk operation took place, that is the secret part of it after the military was removed and the German scientists and others that were not German moved in, there was government oversight in the sense of the direction of the projects and the cooperation that was ongoing and was to continue. And this was what they told these technical directors, says, you will have to learn to work with aliens. They will be part of this project. And they will be cooperating with you to help develop certain technical aspects. And that, of course, is what did happen. I worked at Montauk as Al Bielek, but before I get into that, I want to go into the rest of the story as to what happened to me as I grew up.
Man.
In the life of Al Bielek, in the process of growing up.
So he backtracks here, and I know some of you, if you watch this, may be like, or whatever, yawn and getting bored, but I promise you, stick around. I find that attention's everything, attention span. So I doubt that most people would even have the attention to do this. If you're rocking with me here, man, I really, much love. I appreciate you for it. For real, I actually was like, I spent all this time to put this up to actually get clips. I got the credits to Channel 3X. So I'm like, oh, you could just go, Channel 3X to watch it. But, for me, I just wanted to bring awareness to it. And I kind of felt like I needed to get the whole thing. Honestly, a part of me made this for myself too, as well. So I can have my own backup version, because just in case they decide to take it down. But basically, no. So it's about to get good. It's going to get, it won't get, he's about to backtrack. It's hard for me to tell because it's been so long since I've listened to the whole thing. But I know it picks up here towards the end. Shocking, actually. Okay, here we go.
Yep. Many things I have not covered and perhaps would be of interest.
So right now we're covering his life as Al Bielek. He's going back to when he was Al Bielek, when he gets transferred into a different body. He's a kid. He's the man you see now today.
Interest, more in the sense of my personal life. I live with what were truly are foster parents, but did not know at that time. We moved around at various locations, and my father seeking work. And quite aside from the fact it started in my life in Brooklyn, New Jersey, Brooklyn, New York, and then went to New Jersey, via Long Island, via Patterson, and then eventually settled in New Jersey, first Tenafly, New Jersey, and then Nutley, New Jersey, before I left and went to California. I went through the usual schools and schooling and had some strange interests. Perhaps not so strange, but for, let us say, what was considered the norm at that time, for a kid in junior high to be avidly interested in sci-fi and science fiction was not considered that normal. I was not athletically inclined. I didn't engage in any of the sports. And didn't really have much in the way of girlfriends. I was academic. I even had earned the dubious title of being a walking dictionary when I was in junior high, which perhaps proved to be true later. And had the usual amount of scuffs and scrapes with people who wanted to beat on me and this sort of thing, all process of growing up. After I went to California, that was in 1954, I left my job with Curtis Wright Corporation in New Jersey because I wanted to go to California. And of course, one can always look back in retrospect and say, gee, maybe I should have done that. But I didn't. I didn't go to Germany. I went to California. I was first there. I loved the beaches and found work as a technician. And I continued my schooling and eventually became a consulting electronic engineer. First company I worked for as an engineer was, one was later called Aerospace, but at that time it was called Space Technology Laboratories. Met a lot of interesting people there, and throughout my history in California, which was from 54 to 60, minus a year out in Hawaii for Los Angeles Corporation. Met many interesting people, pursued a lot of interests, and really liked very much the Southern California climate, the whole attitude of people living there, rather loose-knit, not nearly as rigid as the East Coast. Because of that, I've largely stayed in the West ever since. Many strange things happened during that period. I want to cover them very lightly. In 1954, in my driving all over Southern California, up in the desert, every place, out of Los Angeles, San Diego, trips to San Francisco, I used to drive up in the area around Malibu Beach. And then one of the canyon trips up to Topanga Canyon, coming back down, I happened to notice a group of buildings with a name on the side behind a chain link fence, a heavy metal steel fence. And I always got a peculiar feeling about that place, something which I could never explain at that time. Even got to the point where if I park and look at the buildings, why I wanted to park and look at the buildings, I could not explain then. The answer has long since come back to me. I would sometimes pass out in the middle of the afternoon or late afternoon and awaken later and then go driving on to my determined source where I was going at that time. And it left me in a state of not anxiety, but a feeling of what was it about this place that intrigued me. I did not find out about that until in the last year. From California, I went on to Hawaii. I worked for a company called Hoffman Laboratories as a field engineer for the Navy. Field engineer, actually for Hoffman, assigned to the Navy at Pearl Harbor. When I arrived there in July of 1955, eventually found a place to live, but I was assigned to the Pearl Harbor Naval Office, a particular section, and my job as a field engineer for Hoffman Labs was, of course, to inspect their equipment that they had built and supplied to the Navy. As it came into Pearl Harbor, the ships came in for not necessarily overhaul, but general reconditioning, check out all equipments and so forth, and many field engineers from different companies would go aboard ship and check out the various pieces of equipment they were connected to through their corporate affiliations. All of the time that I spent in Pearl Harbor, it had a strange effect on me. It felt like I was back home. I couldn't understand then what that was all about, because as Al Bielek, all of my memories at Cameron had been erased. In a sense, it was back home because I had been there in 1941. Perhaps some of the leakage from 41 and the life as Ed Cameron came through to me in 1955 and 56, because I felt quite at home. And I liked walking down the piers and all of this whole area devoted to the ships and doing my assignments, which were literally to inspect Hoffman's equipment aboard ship, make my reports and all of that. I remained there a little over a year, and in that time, one other strange incident occurred which perplexed me for quite a while, that eventually was resolved when, at a later time, my memories of who I really was came back. Through the party connection, the office connections, I was invited to a party one weekend involving some naval officers, some of the civilian people from that office. It was out in, let's say, a more remote area of Honolulu, out in the boonies, more or less. And it was on a Saturday afternoon. This party was thrown by two naval officers who had a connection with the yard. And everybody was having a great time. But as I imbibed a few more drinks, I did drink a little in those days. I was not an alcoholic, but it was customary, shall we say, in view of the company I kept, and particularly when these Navy parties. We had a few drinks. Nothing unusual about that. What was unusual, and I thought about it many times after that, until the meaning of it finally erupted and fell in on me consciously, was that the two guys who threw the party, both lieutenants in the Navy, in a brown fatigue uniform, a tan fatigue uniform, to me had a funny feeling, like these two guys sort of belonged together, and I couldn't quite understand what it meant. And then as I became more inebriated, if you will, I got the feeling, in a certain sense, I identified with one of them. Now, that didn't mean I had any connection with this person. I didn't know him from Adam, other than from the Navy Yard. I had a feeling in some way that I fitted into this picture. And then I was looking mentally at this other officer. He fit into the picture. Now, who fitted in there? I could never answer that question at that time as to what the other person portrayed, what the other person meant to me. It wasn't for many years, decades afterwards, literally, that I finally figured it out that, to me, on a conscious level, connecting with the subconscious, the two officers represented Duncan and myself from our time in Pearl Harbor, when we were much younger. There was a type of thing where the subconscious was starting to break through at least a little bit and starting to identify on a conscious level with certain events then taking place, namely that party with the two officers. It was a case, looking at it later, where I realized I almost broke through as to identifying a missing part of my past, but I never quite made it. That operation ended in 1956. I returned to the mainland, went through a series of jobs. I'm not going into it. Wound up in Los Angeles working for Space Technology Laboratories, off and on from 1957 to 1960. And then I moved to Houston, Texas. And then I remained out of the California area until 1984. 83 and 84. At that time, having traveled around the U.S., I met many engineers in many walks of life. And the interesting part of it was, as a consultant, I talked with many of these people who have been strange projects, had strange histories to relate, and quite a few of them had quite a bit of knowledge about things like UFOs. I might add, of course, during this period of time, I had a great interest in the whole subject of UFOs. Was it real or was it not? Was there suppression of information and reports? I was sort of neutral, except I had a great and avid interest at that time, perhaps just as much as in the Philadelphia experiment. In 1951, before I left for the West Coast, through connections of a society I then belonged to, which was the NSS, National Spelunking Society. I met Ivan T. Sanderson. Now, he was in the New York grotto. I was in the Jersey grotto. And I got an invite to come over and visit with him. So I did, and I met him one day and one night. He had an apartment in New York City at that time off on 45th Street off of Broadway. And I visited him, and we went out for dinner, and we talked about many things. And a very interesting man. I didn't know his whole history then. I learned more later. He was ex-British intelligence who stayed in the United States at the tail end of the war because they were going to ship him back to England on one of the B-26 bombers. And he said the survivability of people on those bombers going across the Atlantic was not very good. So he jumped ship, so to speak, and stayed in New York, went undercover, and then when the war was over, surfaced. He was well known for many years in the Gary Moore shows on TV in New York, of which I did see a few. When in 1952, I went traveling in 53, and then wound up in Los Angeles. I lost connection with him from 1953 until 1963. In 1963, I was in Pennsylvania on an assignment. Reconnected with him. And of course, we discussed many other things at that time. Some years later, of course, he was trying to determine the history of the Philadelphia experiment because he kept hearing rumors of it himself. And he became very interested, as I did. This was in the late 60s, early 70s, before he died in 1973. He could never, including with his connections with the British intelligence and with the Pentagon, could never get any straight information out of anyone about the Philadelphia experiment. It was totally denied to him. Other than the fact, yes, there was a USS Eldridge. There was a real ship by that name, and that's all the Navy would tell him. That is about all I would learn at that time. And, of course, a series of books were written later. Thin Air in 1978, and then the Philadelphia Experiment Project Invisibility in 1979, Berlitz and Moore. And all it did in those reports was stir the pot and quite literally brought the subject alive again in the popular press, and it never died from that point on. But I still, at that point, did not know that I had a connection with the project. This did not come for quite a while later. Ivan tried to get to the bottom of it, and he never could. I was on a staff at that time working in a group on a subject matter called mind control, which was very interesting because there wasn't much information available at that time, but I had a great deal of interest. And of course, this expanded much later into a full-blown interest, but that came in the 80s and the 90s. Not to get ahead of my story here, Ivan died. I continued what little research I was then doing on myself, and I continued to work in various locations around the country. I had to take a break. In retrospect, dealing with Ivan Sanderson, I did, shall we say, make it into one of his books. There was some reference to myself in one of his books. He wrote many, both on natural phenomena, natural life. The Abominable Snowman, I think, was the first one he ever did, and there was perhaps worldwide acclaim for it. We did a series on various things, and one of them was about undersea civilizations. He did one on UFOs that caught the attention of CIA, NSA, and other intelligence agencies that didn't want him to write it, so he wrote it anyway. He took a number of literary risks, but he always came out on top. It was unfortunate that he and his abilities were lost, but that's the way it goes.
I'll have to go back and find out what book he said. I'm listening, but Abominable Snowman, something like that. But yeah, that's how I find gems, hidden gems that were popular yesterday, not popular today, things of that sort. And they usually give me a lot of understanding.
His wife had died 13 months to the day prior that he did. The group was broken up. The files remained in the organization he founded, which I also was a part of. Finally went into limbo, in his magazine, which had been published for many years, entitled Pursuit. It is no longer published and hasn't been now for almost 10 years. In 1983, I was back to Los Angeles working for a company known as Advanced Semiconductor Products. President Ray Wynn, I mention his name for a very good reason. He, in his own way, was highly frustrated. He was a genius in many respects. He developed a thin film technology, which is today used in the entire semiconductor industry. At that time, there were others making similar films, but he finally mastered the process, took out patents, and eventually collected royalties from everybody. And as the product demand was enormous, the entire industry in the U.S. came to him because what it did in the processing of major, larger size semiconductor chips, the yield was quite low. You had to go in ultra clean rooms to produce these things, and of course, layer after layer is put on these things to make a very complex chip. But if you do not protect it properly from dust, one little mite of dust can ruin the chip, or can actually ruin an entire bowl, or boule as it was called, in which there were many chips being manufactured on this wafer. When they were finished, they were good, they were cut off, and of course went through further processing. But he found a way to develop a thin film which was totally transparent to light at whatever range they were using, which in some cases included UV light. And the yield jumped remarkably. Some cases it was as low as 20%. He was able to get yields up to 80% and better. Of course, they sought after him. He had patents. He was making all kinds of money, and that was the principal thing he had worked on, and then started the company Advanced Semiconductor Products related to his chemical thin film technology, in which I designed some electronic equipment for him. Ray was well known in the industry. He eventually wound up being a multimillionaire and retired from Santa Barbara to Santa Fe, New Mexico. And as far as I know, he disappeared several years ago. He did have problems with his heart, and he may have passed on. I have never yet heard fully. But what is important is that in that period of time, 1983-84, the Montauk Project ended. I was still not aware of my involvement in it, and the thing becomes rather difficult to portray, and even more difficult to understand how I could be working two jobs in two locations at the same time. I was working as an engineer in Los Angeles, 83-84, and prior to that, from 76 on, the whole period during which I was involved with the Montauk Project. The beginning phases of the Montauk Project I want to get into, but I want to state that on a Sunday afternoon in August of 1983, when I was sunning myself on the beach in one of the lakes north of Los Angeles, up in the hills, one afternoon, I spent...
Now, just for you all who are like, if you're thinking like me, if you've been watching this intently and you're lost in his life, you're like, you know, a friend of mine said that he went on a date with a girl to see the Spider-Verse, you know, his Christian girlfriend. They went in the Spider-Verse, the multiverse, something like that. In the middle of the movie, somebody yelled, "I'm confused." So sometimes whenever it's like multi-dimensional, all this multi-dimensional thinking, you're not, it's metaphysical thinking, you haven't been exposed to it, it can get confusing. So I'm jumping in here because it just hit me that some people may never heard of this concept. There's a book called Journey of Souls that introduced me to this concept that a being, maybe even the book Conversation with God as well, that a being could be, we can actually live two of our lives at once. Like you could actually be living this life and another life halfway around the world at the same time right now. That's how cool our souls are. We never take all of our, according to Journey of Souls, we never take all of our energy from our soul, our higher self, into one incarnation. It would overload our brains, the human brain. This is actually what Jesus was telling in the story of the prodigal son. But I'm not trying to get into that. I'm not trying to get. I want to keep this focus on Al Bielek, but you can't. So right now he is in the 1984, because at some point he comes back as Al Bielek. Ed Cameron travels to 1984 to end the Montauk experiment. Remember when he was talking about they destroy those machines? That's what ends the Montauk experiment in 1984. But he was only there briefly as Ed Cameron. So it doesn't necessarily mean they were both coexisting at the same time. Ed Cameron and Al Bielek in two separate souls. Even I get confused. You see, here we go. We're going to jump back in.
I had the feeling I was free of something. I just felt a relief and a freedom.
Back up a little bit.
products related to his chemical thin film technology, in which I designed some electronic equipment for him. Ray was well known in the industry. He eventually wound up being a multimillionaire and retired from Santa Barbara to Santa Fe, New Mexico. And so far as I know, he disappeared several years ago. He did have problems with his heart, and he may have passed on. I have never yet heard fully. But what is important is that in that period of time, 1983-84, the Montauk project ended. I was still not aware of my involvement in it, and the thing becomes rather difficult to portray, and even more difficult to understand how I could be working two jobs in two locations at the same time. I was working as an engineer in Los Angeles, 83-84, and prior to that, from 76 on, the whole period during which I was involved with the Montauk project. The beginning phases of the Montauk project I want to get into, but I want to state that on a Sunday afternoon in August of 1983, when I was sunning myself on the beach in one of the lakes north of Los Angeles, up in the hills, one afternoon, I suddenly had the feeling I was free of something. I just felt a relief and a freedom. That was probably the day the project went down, but I've yet to correlate and find old calendars to see if that was the exact day. Now, how did I get involved with the Montauk project? And the second question I will answer later is, how could I possibly be working in Los Angeles and on Long Island at the same time, or what appeared to be the same time? In 65 and 66, let's go back a little further, 55 and 56, I was in Hawaii working for the Navy Department, as I'd already stated. There was one night when I was sitting on the seawall outside the Royal Hawaiian Hotel in Waikiki, as I lived in Waikiki in an apartment there during this period. I was sitting there quite late at night and relaxing, the Hawaiian music around me and the people going by. It was a very relaxing atmosphere there, at least it was in those days. I quite literally fell asleep on the seawall, sitting up, something I was known to do occasionally, and woke up perhaps an hour and a half later feeling like something very strange had happened. I had not the slightest idea what it was. I didn't know what it was until many years later. That was the point, as I determined after I recovered my memories of Montauk, which started in 1986. That was the point at which I was inducted into the Montauk project. The man who was a station master, and I'm referring to the Montauk Air Force Station operations, which became what we call the Montauk Project, started up approximately in 1968 with the advent of the German scientists moving out there, and then later incorporating the services of various extraterrestrial groups, all of which I had to work with. But I did not become involved with the project myself until 1976, and that was when it became more or less official and went online. Online then meant, of course, a lot of breaks in the process, a lot of further engineering to make the time tunnel system work properly. But my first recollection of the involvement in the project, and this took place from 1956 up to 1976, was being in the office of the station master, a man by the name of Jack Pruitt. Pruitt is known somewhat through the industry, more perhaps the banking industry than anything else, because knowing his son and having met him and talked with him several times, he still lives in the New York, Long Island area. He didn't know that his father was a station master of the project, but we've later proved it. He had me in his office, questioning me, and a series of events preceded that involving certain bars on the island of Waikiki and meeting people whom I didn't know who they were, who would disappear. And later on, I worked with that same individual because he was very dogging me to find out if I was the person that Jack was looking for. So I find myself in his office. And of course, he's asking me about my history, what I've done, what I was doing as, what I was doing as an engineer. I have an understanding you have an interest in UFOs. Oh, yes, I do. I wasn't perhaps that overtly direct about it at that point. He says, well, if you have an interest in it, how would you like to see one? Oh, I became quite interested at that point, so he took me into one of the underground facilities at Montauk. I might add at this point, you not only have the surface facility, the buildings and the tower and all of this, which can be seen readily, but now sealed off, but then open, was a complete underground labyrinth of 6 levels, and adjacent to and part of these 6 levels of underground, which were built by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers between the beginning of the century and the major construction began in 1928 and 1933, as I've seen the blueprints. They built a huge underground facility which overlapped into an underground cavern system. There's very extensive underground caverns under Long Island. And they are, in a sense, part of the Montauk Project. And the Montauk Project can be accessed through the underground tunnels if you know where to enter. But he took me into one of the underground chambers, one of the underground rooms. This one was a natural one. And there was sitting a very large gold-colored UFO, approximately 60 feet in diameter, sitting on a tripod, literally barely making it fitting in this room. The question was, how did it get there? Well, he didn't answer that question for me at that time. But it was there and it was trapped and it was obvious it would never get out. So he asked me a question. Well, how would you like to work on this? Well, the bait had been thrown and I'd been hooked. And of course, I said, yes, I'd like to work on this. So I became a part of the Montauk Project. I might point out that every one of the people who worked at Montauk, in essence, were volunteers. And there were no salaries paid to any of these people who volunteered. And those military personnel that were still involved with the project were TDY, temporary duty, paid out of whatever their normal billet was, so that no monetary exchange in terms of government money was ever recorded directly connectable to Montauk. They maintained a high degree of secrecy and were very successful at it. I spent literally most of my time from 1976 to 1983 in the underground at Montauk. Now, how could I do this when at the same time I was an engineer working on the outside? There were 2 aspects of this. One is more readily explainable than the other. Aspect number 1 was, as I found out in later research, I knew then, and I didn't at that time in 1976 know about it. I only knew that I went on an underground railroad system which connected Los Angeles to Newark, New Jersey, and then the interchange system at Newark went on out under New York to Long Island with 2 stops. One was at the EIL Corporation Complex in Farmingdale, Long Island, and the last stop was at Montauk Point. This underground rail system, which has been testified to by Phil Schneider before he died, as he said he personally worked on constructing it, is a very strange, basically alien technology design rail system which does not have any rails. We call it a rail system for convenience. It's actually magnetic levitation, operates at extremely high speed, and the tunnels bored 14 feet in diameter between New York and Los Angeles. You can make that trip in 2 hours. It's faster than any aircraft other than supersonic, which do not fly over the U.S. by law.
So this underground rail system, they call it that, but it has no rails. It's magnetic and you float. I think I've seen something like this at Futurama.
And I did ride that thing fairly regularly. There are points of entrance. I remember some of them, but not most of them. And this network is all over the U.S., into Canada, probably into Mexico at this time. It definitely goes into Puerto Rico. And so far as I know, no underwater connections to Europe, but there's a system all over Europe and through Russia. This is a vast underground network interconnecting underground as well as surface bases and locations. I used to ride that rather regularly, and that I can understand, making a high-speed trip out to Montauk and then coming back in 2 hours and resuming my normal life and duties after having that part which I worked on at Montauk erased. That part is understandable. The other aspect, which is not so understandable, is how I could spend so many years out there working on these projects, overlapping the time when I was also an engineer working on the outside in normal civilian or semi-government operations. To explain this more fully, and I'm sure it will not sit too well with some of the people listening with this, but I'll have to tell it the way I know it. What the German scientists were working on at Montauk, and with alien help, finally were able to perfect, was a time tunnel. We call it a tunnel for a reason, because in the later aspects, not the earliest research, it was underground, involved a series of special antennas which produced with some very complex electronics a portal, an artificial portal in the rock wall, which when it was fully operational, looked like an open tunnel, was illuminated for reasons I do not understand, and the electronics, the computers, and the persons working this would set it up to be able to go to any physical location on this planet from Montauk Point. It would literally transport you from point A to point B instantaneously, or almost instantaneously. Not absolute instantaneity, but within a second or two. And maintain, if you wanted, the same time frame as we were working in at that time, or shift time reference, past or future.
Okay, this is huge. Guys, so they're saying pretty much, he's saying, what Al Bielek's saying is, this tunnel that they created, imagine what I see is like something artificial in the wall, like you could actually see. Remember he said at one point the thing just absorbed him in when he traveled. I forgot, he says it back in the same video. And then he arrived instantaneously at another location. So what he's saying here is that this has already been created, that people could travel anywhere they want. And this becomes important because down the road, I'm going to spoil it for you, that when they learn how to cloak scenes like this, they could actually literally, you can just walk into a different scene, be somewhere else. Anyway, so it sounds unbelievable to the ears. That's why I had to get this recorded, because when I go around saying it, people just look at me like really crazy. And it's even scary because this is like 2024. And Al Bielek is saying they have this. What are we in the 1980s now? His life is everywhere. I don't know where we're at. So it's been out for like 50, who knows how long.
When they finally got these tunnels working, and working satisfactorily, of course, they could pick a person up, move them where they want, pull them across the country, pull them from another country, put them in on the project, and then return them. And since they could shift time, they could use you for weeks or months and then put you back in the time point where you left.
Are you hearing
within a few milliseconds, if you will.
3 milliseconds.
This automatically erases the memories without any effort on their part.
It automatically erases.
Because the subconscious mind will reject, and the conscious mind working with it will reject the idea that you may have worked for months on a project where only a fraction of a second has expired in your alleged real-time reality.
I know I should leave it up to you to rewind, but I'm going to go ahead and rewind.
At this point, one must one thing with this, but I'll have to tell it the way I know it. What the German scientists were working on at Montauk, and with alien help, finally were able to perfect, was a time tunnel. We call it a tunnel for a reason.
And with alien help. I once heard something on YouTube where a girl was, she asked if she had any kids out there. I'm not going to say where, but she asked if she had any kids. She was in hypnosis. And it turns out that she was abducted. And but she turns out she was abducted in a similar fashion with using a type of tunnel like this. And yes, that she did have kids that were hybrids. But here we go.
Because in the later aspects, not the earliest research, it was underground, involved a series of special antennas which produced with some very complex electronics a portal, an artificial portal in the rock wall, which when it was fully operational, looked like an open tunnel, was illuminated for reasons I do not understand, and the electronics, the computers, and the persons working this would set it up to be able to go to any physical location on this planet from Montauk Point. It would literally transport you from point A to point B instantaneously, or almost instantaneously. Not absolute instantaneity, but within a second or two. And maintain, if you wanted, the same time frame as we were working in at that time, or shift time reference, past or future. When they finally got these tunnels working, and working satisfactorily, of course, they could pick a person up, move them where they want, pull them across the country, pull them from another country, put them in on the project, and then return them. And since they could shift time, they could use you for weeks or months and then put you back in the time point where you left within a few milliseconds, if you will. This automatically erases the memories without any effort on their part, because the subconscious mind will reject, and the conscious mind working with it will reject the idea that you may have worked for months on a project where only a fraction of a second has expired in your alleged real-time reality. At this point, one must wonder, how can this happen? And one also has to look at a larger picture. Albert Einstein, going back for a moment to the Philadelphia experiment era, had created in 1929 the unified field theory. On his public record, he offered it. Lord Russell of England read it, and he said, there's things in here which literally are too far advanced for humanity at this time. He said, I suggest, speaking to Einstein, that you withdraw this and say it has errors or whatever you want to do, but just withdraw it. And Einstein did. It's not well known that it was offered and then withdrawn, but the public record says that it was never completed. They kept saying he found errors and so forth. The facts are that in 1938, the unified field theory was completed, but it was classified and is still classified to this day. It became part of the theoretical background for the Philadelphia experiment. But it also, in the process of looking at this and other things, as I did, one has to understand that there are multiple realities. Physically, we only know this one. And we work in it, we live in it, and so forth. But as some of the mathematics of various people show, not only Hilbert, but also a well-known mathematician scientist from Stanford, SRI, Dr. Tiller, has pointed out that there are multiple parallel realities and we can be part of any one of them, and it is possible to shift. And of course, what he pointed out was we are in what, let us say for reference, we are in number one. Whether or not we are in number one is another matter. We are in a reality, which we accept and we know, and we do not know of or sense these parallel realities. Part of the work at Montauk was to access these parallel realities and also to manipulate time in such a manner that it becomes virtually impossible to know what your reality is that you're in when you're working at Montauk or on a Montauk-type project. And it may be totally skewed from the reality which I, speaking to you through this camera, and other people perhaps watching this know. And as Al Bielek, the engineer, knew. You get to the point, finally, what is reality? What do we really know about it? The function of Montauk was to explore, their official charter said their function was to explore all aspects of reality, physics, and whatever else they could find, and time. And of course, reports were made on a regular basis. Where they all went, we don't know. But I spent many years there on that project. I got off the UFO project after a while. I was involved in several other projects, including some of the time tunnel project, which involved travel to other locations. And I will fill you in on a little of this. One of the other projects involved, of course, what I will report on openly is the Montauk Boys. Now, what was the Montauk Boys project? It started officially about 19...
So we're going to back up a little bit. I'm telling y'all it's heating up. It's heating up, but you got to realize in my real time, it's close to my sleep time. And I'm like, oh boy, it's heating up. So that was huge. You just said, what is reality? You know, what is reality? As if we can go back and change time, travel down the time, back and forth. He's like, what is reality? He questions. You know, this made me think about how some of the largest questions for people's happiness comes down to them understanding philosophy. What is reality? What is this matrix? What is this that we're involved in? That was huge. He's gonna talk about some things later. He says it in Channel 3X. Y'all got to go here. Channel 3X. Y'all got to go here. But he says in another video that we won World War II by us. The U.S., the United States, won World War II by going back in time and getting like plutonium or something like that. It's crazy. You know, it's crazy. Anyway, he says, cause I like to let him say it. So he's about to start talking about the Montauk Boys, what year is founded. He's 1970 something, and we're about to get to this. Is very important as well.
In 76, there was a lot of precursor work in which I will have to go into a great deal of history.
1976, there was a lot of precursor work, which he won't go into. That has a great deal of history.
But this all involves mind manipulation and mind control. The project formally started at Montauk. And I'm talking about that aspect dealing with the boys, males, who were into mind control manipulation. The overall project heading, which covered both this aspect and the older cult techniques for females, is Project Monarch. Project Monarch, briefly, was a name given to the whole area involving mind manipulation and mind control. The old cult techniques going back thousands of years were used on females, taking them basically from families who had known at least 3 generations of child abuse, sexual child abuse. And these females would be preconditioned, if you will, for the training they would receive to split their mind further and set them up to be sex slaves or whatever else they wanted them for. These were mind control female slaves, and they would last a certain number of years. Kathy O'Brien, in her book, The Transformation of America, is one outstanding example of this type of thing using the older techniques. The newer techniques were physical at first, then electronic, but involved primarily the use of boys because of the chakra setup in the human body of the male. It is not identical to that of the female. The polarities are reversed. Therefore, it became easier to work on.
Whoa, he just said a lot there. You could miss a lot. He said physical as well as electronic. These mind control techniques, there's 2 different techniques they're going to go down to use to control females versus male because the chakra setup is different, which is mind-blowing for me as Mr. Metaphysical, over here and studying and understanding all the metaphysical. But then also he says, Al says here that, anyway, I'm losing it. I'm just going to back up. We're just going to back up. I told you, there's a lot said there. Oh, what he also said was that it goes from, there's techniques. It starts off physical, but it's going to move into electronic. And, we got these frequencies. I don't know if anyone else hears them. I hear them sometimes. So this becomes important for how you want to govern your daily life and all these frequencies being sent out here to condition the masses. I almost don't want to say, I want to let you arrive at your own conclusions. Say, okay, hey, don't come whack me. Anyway, here we go.
Males. The object was to see if they could produce a complete set of mind-controlled, subconsciously implanted, and externally triggered on demand at the time that they wanted, a person who was totally programmed to do something, but this person obviously would know nothing about it, and would live a normal life, or what appeared to be a normal life, and could be at a later time utilized for some project, whether it's government sponsored or not, didn't matter. Whoever had the controls, had the reins on these individuals, the handlers, if you will, working for whomever they worked for, would be able to trigger these programmed people to do whatever they wanted them to do at some future time. Being in this project for a number of years, I asked questions. I never got many answers. What did they want them for? I never got an answer. But of course, looking at current history as well as of recent, let's say 10 years, it became fairly obvious. There's a lot of assassinations. There's a lot of killings in the schoolyard, which were all basically all Montauk Boy projects, where they were controlled to create the killing and the situation, which is, of course, forced desire for further gun control. This is one aspect of the whole situation. Other things that can be used for, of course, are assassins, agitators, create fires, create riots. If you use your imagination, literally anything possible in the gamut of riots.
We've seen those things where the same actor showing up as an agitator at multiple protests, things like that. Let's go. I'm not saying that's it exactly, but we could help. We could try to draw connections.
Subversion of normal society. Spies.
This is so huge. This is huge. Okay, now you see I've been kind of dull the whole time that he's cooking right now. Subversion of normal society. Shout out to Al Bielek. I think he was on to something, and he he died too soon. He died right before 2012, which Law of One says was a type of an ascension. So I don't know if it's anyway. We're not gonna get lost and go on that tangent. He died I think around 2011, I think. But during his time, he was like, he's gonna say here later on in this next 10 minutes, 20, 30 minutes, is because they start how as they evolve and start using frequencies and mind control to control the people. And he sees more and more Montauk boys. He's like, who's controlling? He's like, he concludes that someone off planetary is doing the mind control. And if you've read Law of One, you're going to see some analogies here, some connections, and you're going to be able to connect the dots. So this is fascinating. But the dots I'm seeing right here, where I said this is huge, I don't want to stop for no reason, is because, maybe I can splice it with another video to show you, but there's some connections between these mind control techniques and what they say in Law of One that off-planetary aliens are using, particularly the Orions are using to control humanity from a distance. So in other words, we live in a world where there's so much fear today, but who's creating this fear? I've jokingly said with all these scary movies, the most scary thing is the human animal, but the human being. But is it really the human being, or is other people, these beings, controlling us by creating these school shootings or scary things to inject a certain amount of fear so that our spirituality, our levels doesn't rise? Because if the heart is an active, once the heart gets activated, it's like game over. We're unified. We're no longer. This is in Law of One. See, it takes a long time to connect all this, and that's why I say, you should join me in like the Mr. Metaphysical community. Find the links on the website where I really cut loose. I don't got it going right now, so that's why I say you have to find it. But maybe I'll include a link of this video or another video or something of that show. I'll try my best. But for now, know that this is huge, what he's saying, because we're so scared of one another, but is it really us that we're scared of? Is it, are we the ones responsible for the traumas that we've experienced? That's a big time question, y'all. And if you start understanding this, you understand the need to go get therapy. Shout out to therapy, our sister company, Mr. Metaphysical Health and Wellness. Also, we're going to be working on different alternative states of consciousness, ayahuasca, ketamine, assisted psychotherapy, hypnosis, connecting people with their unconscious minds. So this becomes important. And guys, if you don't have the money to do all this, meditate. See a psychic, talk to a psychic, ask questions. So this is huge what he's saying right now. Okay.
In your imagination, you would probably be able to name virtually anything that these boys could be set up for. The killing and the situation, which is, of course, forced the desire for a complete set of mind-controlled, subconsciously implanted, and externally triggered on demand at the time that they wanted, a person who was totally programmed to do something, but this person obviously would know nothing about it, and would live a normal life, or what appeared to be a normal life, and could be at a later time utilized for some project, whether it's government-sponsored or not, didn't matter. Whoever had the controls, had the reins on these individuals, the handlers, if you will, working for whomever they worked for, would be able to trigger these programmed people to do whatever they wanted them to do at some future time. Being in this project for a number of years, I asked questions. I never got many answers. What did they want them for? I never got an answer. But of course, looking at current history as well as the recent, let's say, 10 years, it became fairly obvious. There's a lot of assassinations. There's a lot of killings in the schoolyard, which are all basically all Montauk Boy projects, where they were controlled to create the killing and the situation, which is, of course, forced the desire for further gun control. This is one aspect of the whole situation. Other things they can be used for, of course, are assassins, agitators, create fires, create riots. If you use your imagination, literally anything possible in the gamut of riots, subversion of normal society, spies. In your imagination, you would probably be able to name virtually anything that these boys could be set up for. At this point, we'll take a slight break, and we'll continue with what is a Montauk Boy and how are these programs done.
Subversion of normal society. I backed it up for you guys, so I wanted. So you've already heard this, so your ears aren't playing tricks on you. You guys about to touch on the Montauk Boys.
In reference to the Montauk Project, I want to show you at least one picture. There are many that have been taken of Montauk. All that I have, of course, been taken after the project was down and collapsed. There's one particular one, though, that I think is perhaps the symbol of Montauk, and that's the radar tower. I'm going to put that up and show it. This picture is significant because the radar tower was built in the late 40s, early 50s as part of the early SAGE radar warning system, which was perfected engineering-wise at Montauk and then the beam used, but that was part of the SAGE system. And it's become, you might say, a symbol of Montauk. Some people say Montauk doesn't exist. They don't know what they're talking about because the whole physical structure is still there. The underground has been sealed off since. What are we talking about when we say a Montauk Boy? That is an appellation, a term we coined, meaning a young boy. I do not mean a young adult. It's actually around the age of puberty, though, of course, this has been ongoing since '76, who has been run through the program to be literally programmed. The selection is, of course, around the age of puberty, and it's a nickname we've put on them because they've been programmed sober, he asked the person who was exhibiting and trying to sell the Reich equipment, "Is this all you have?" He says, "Well, no." He says, "Really, you need to get in touch with one of the curators and the people who are holding the rest of Reich's estate." He said he has a home in another location in Vermont that very few people know about, and it's not just Rangeley, Maine. He said he had another home. Call so-and-so and contact and go up and see him. He may have something you may be more interested in. Preston did this, invited.
My apologies, y'all. They know I'm on to them, and they're messing with me over here. So it's hard to explain what happened in the studio, but there's a lapse, and I don't know where the lapse is. So I think we're going to go ahead and end this video. Check out part 6, Al Bielek Autobiography. We're going to touch on the I'm going to rewind it and start it, even though that's that's the number one thing I didn't want to do. Maybe I could just keep on going here and then just edit that clip out. I don't know. I suck at editing. That's the problem. Well, I have a poor signal, so it may not be there. I'm saying something here that says my signal connection is unstable. Okay. Maybe I'll just back up a little bit here. I want people. I don't want people who just hear clips of this. I want people who are actually locking in and hearing this. It builds. So we're gonna back it up a couple minutes that I may have lost. No, we're gonna go ahead and end it. I'm pissed, but guys, part 6, Al Bielek Autobiography. Check it out.